picture a young woman, barely 21 years old, wrapped inside a rolled-up carpet, being carried on the shoulder of a single servant through a guarded palace at midnight, her heart pounding against the fabric, knowing that if she is caught, she will die before she ever gets the chance to speak a single word to the most powerful man in the world. That is not the opening of a myth. That is not a scene invented for a screen. That actually happened in the summer of the year 48 before Christ, in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, and the woman inside that carpet would go on to become the last pharaoh Egypt would ever know. A woman so brilliant, so complicated, so endlessly written about and endlessly misunderstood that 2,000 years after her death, we are still trying to separate the myth from the person. Mysterious tone. Before we go further, if you are listening to this tonight, comment down below and tell me where in the world you are tucking in to hear this story. And while you are there, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because we are about to spend the next 2 hours together walking through one of the most astonishing lives in the history of the ancient world. And I do not want you to miss the next one. For over 2,000 years, the world has told her story mostly through the eyes of the men who defeated her, the men who had every reason to paint her as reckless, seductive, and dangerous, rather than what the evidence actually suggests she was. One of the sharpest political minds of the ancient world, a woman who kept a fractured, indebted kingdom independent from Rome for 2 full decades through nothing but her own intelligence, her own charisma, and her own relentless will. Bold statement tone. By the time this queen took her final breath, she had outmaneuvered rivals who wanted her dead since before she could walk, seduced and allied herself with 2 of the most powerful men Rome ever produced, and very nearly changed the entire course of Western history. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She never had a single drop of native Egyptian blood in her veins. Her family had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and in all that time, out of every single member of her dynasty, she was the only one who ever bothered to learn the Egyptian language. Shocking factone. Think about that for a moment. Imagine a family ruling a country for 300 years, generation after generation, king after king, queen after queen, and never once learning to speak to the people they governed in their own tongue. That was the house of Ptolemy. Greek in blood, Greek in culture, Greek in every festival and every coin, and every temple inscription, ruling over a land of pyramids and priests, and a river that flooded every summer like clockwork. A land they treated almost like a foreign country they happened to own. And then came Cleopatra, who looked at that inheritance and decided she wanted something different. She wanted to be Egypt's queen in more than name. She wanted the people to see her, actually see her, as one of their own. Even though she was descended from a Macedonian general who had marched into this land alongside Alexander the Great himself. Let me take you back even further, because to understand who Cleopatra was, you first have to understand the world she was born into, a world built entirely on the shoulders of one extraordinary man who died 300 years before she ever drew breath. In the spring of the year 332 before Christ, a young conqueror named Alexander, barely in his mid-20s, marched his army into Egypt and was welcomed not as an invader but almost as a liberator, because the Egyptians had spent over a century chafing under Persian rule, and Alexander offered them something new. He walked deep into the desert to consult the oracle of the god Amun, and the priests there greeted him, according to legend, as the son of the god himself. And on the coast, where the Mediterranean meets the edge of Africa, Alexander looked out at a strip of land between the sea and a lake and decided that here, in this exact spot, he would build a city that would carry his name for all of history. He did not live to see it finished. He died in Babylon in 323 before Christ, still a young man. His empire suddenly without an heir strong enough to hold it together, and in the chaos that followed, his generals tore his conquests apart between them like wolves dividing a carcass. One of those generals, a shrewd and careful man named Ptolemy, claimed Egypt for himself. He even managed, through a mixture of daring and outright theft, to hijack Alexander's own funeral procession and redirect the body to Egypt, burying his former king in the city that bore his name, a masterstroke of propaganda that told every Egyptian and every Greek watching that Ptolemy, and Ptolemy alone, was the true heir to Alexander's legacy. That city, Alexandria, became something the ancient world had never quite seen before. It was not simply a capital, it was the beating intellectual heart of the entire Mediterranean world. Ptolemy and his descendants poured unimaginable wealth into building a great library there, an institution so vast in its ambition that its founders reportedly tried to acquire a copy of every book that had ever been written anywhere on Earth. Ships docking in the harbor were searched, and if scrolls were found on board, they were confiscated, copied, and only the copies were returned to their owners, while the originals stayed in Alexandria forever. Attached to the library stood the Museion, a kind of research institute unlike anything else in the ancient world, where the greatest mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and poets of the age lived on royal salaries and spent their days simply thinking, calculating, dissecting, arguing, and writing. It was here that a scholar measured the circumference of the Earth using nothing but the angle of shadows at noon, and got a number stunningly close to the truth. It was here that the foundations of geometry were laid down in a textbook that would be used to teach students for the next 2,000 years. And it was not only the library that made Alexandria feel like a city plucked out of legend. Rising from an island connected to the mainland by a long stone causeway stood the Pharaohs, a lighthouse so tall, so entirely unlike anything else built before it, that later generations would count it among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At night, a fire burning at its summit was reflected and magnified by great polished mirrors, throwing a beam of light out across the dark water that sailors claimed they could see from many miles out to sea, guiding merchant ships loaded with grain, papyrus, glass, and spices safely into the greatest harbor in the Mediterranean. Alexandria was laid out on a grid, wide straight avenues intersecting at right angles, a rarity in the ancient world where most cities grew in the tangled, organic way that centuries of unplanned building tends to produce. Here everything felt deliberate. The royal quarter alone, according to ancient descriptions, took up perhaps a third or even a quarter of the entire city, palace after palace, garden after garden, built up over generations by successive Ptolemaic rulers, who each wanted to leave their own mark on the skyline. Along the harbor stood a monumental building believed by ancient visitors to house the actual embalmed body of Alexander the Great himself, still resting inside a glass or crystal coffin. An object of pilgrimage for kings and conquerors who traveled from distant lands specifically to gaze upon the face of the man who had, in a single decade, redrawn the map of the known world. Reflective tone. Imagine growing up as a child in a city like that, walking past a monument to a demigod on your way to your language lessons, passing beneath colonnades built by your own ancestors. Knowing that scholars from every corner of the civilized world had traveled here specifically because Alexandria, and Alexandria alone, was considered the center of human knowledge. That was simply an ordinary afternoon for the young Cleopatra. That was the everyday backdrop of an extraordinary childhood. This was the world into which Cleopatra would eventually be born, a world of staggering intellectual wealth sitting right alongside staggering political brutality, because the family that built all of this magnificence was also, quite frankly, one of the most murderous royal families in recorded history. The Ptolemies had a habit that horrifies most people the first time they learn about it, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. To keep the bloodline pure and to keep power concentrated entirely within the family, brothers married sisters, generation after generation. Reflective tone. It is easy for us, looking back from where we stand now, to recoil at that. But if you try, just for a moment, to see it through their eyes, you start to understand the logic, even if you cannot forgive it. In a world without safe deposit boxes, without banks, without any guarantee that a marriage alliance to a foreign kingdom would not simply collapse the moment that kingdom decided your family was more useful dead than alive. Marrying within the family was, in a strange and tragic way, considered the safest option. It kept the throne inside four walls. It meant no outside families could claim a stake in the kingdom through marriage. Of course, it also meant that murder, poison, and betrayal were not exceptions in this family. They were simply how business got done. Brothers killed brothers, mothers killed sons, sisters plotted against sisters. Consider just one example from a few generations before Cleopatra's birth. A queen named Cleopatra III spent years locked in an open, bitter power struggle with her own son, each of them ruling different portions of the kingdom at different times, each of them trying to outmaneuver and eventually destroy the other, until the son finally forced his own mother into exile. Consider another ancestor, a king who murdered his own son in a fit of jealous rage, and then, in an act of almost unimaginable cruelty, sent the boy's dismembered body parts to the child's mother as a birthday gift, timed with calculated cruelty to arrive on the very day she was celebrating. These were not distant legends whispered about ancient, half-forgotten kings. These were the great-grandparents and great-uncles of the family Cleopatra was born into, close enough in time that the stories would have been told and retold within the palace walls where she grew up, cautionary tales about what happened to those who trusted too easily, or who hesitated too long before striking first. By the time Cleopatra was born, somewhere around the year 69 before Christ, this pattern of violence within the family had been running for 250 years, and it would be naive to think that a child born into that house could somehow grow up untouched by it. She learned very early, in other words, that survival in her family was never guaranteed by blood alone. It had to be earned, defended, and if necessary, seized. Her father was a man history remembers by the unflattering nickname Olitis, which means, roughly, the flute player, because he loved music and performance more than the difficult grinding business of actually governing a kingdom. Egypt under Olitis was a country in genuine trouble. The old Ptolemaic Empire that had once stretched across islands and coastlines throughout the eastern Mediterranean had shrunk down to almost nothing but the Nile Valley itself, and even that core territory was under constant threat, not from any foreign army marching in with swords drawn, but from something far more dangerous and far more patient, Rome. By the time Cleopatra was a small child, Rome had become the single dominant power of the entire Mediterranean world, a republic that had swallowed kingdom after kingdom, and Egypt, for all its glittering wealth and ancient prestige, survived only because Rome found it more useful, for the moment, as a client state than as a conquered province. Elites spent enormous sums of borrowed money bribing Roman senators just to keep Rome from formally annexing his kingdom outright, sums so large that he was forced to borrow from Roman moneylenders at ruinous rates of interest, mortgaging his own kingdom's future to buy himself another year, another season, another chance to keep his throne intact. And this constant financial desperation, this constant humiliating dependence on foreign goodwill, was the political climate that little Cleopatra grew up breathing in every single day of her childhood. We do not know a great deal about Cleopatra's earliest years, and honestly, that mystery is part of what makes her so fascinating to study even now. Unlike some royal children whose every milestone was recorded by court scribes, we have no detailed diary of her toddler years, no letters describing her first words. What we do know, pieced together from later accounts, is that she received an extraordinary education, the kind reserved for the daughters of the most powerful families in the ancient world. She would have studied under the finest tutors Alexandria's scholarly community could offer, learning rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech that mattered enormously in a world where a queen might need to talk her way out of a death sentence with nothing but her own words. She studied philosophy. She studied mathematics and astronomy, subjects that Alexandria's scholars had turned into genuine sciences rather than mere superstition. And she studied languages, an extraordinary number of languages, until, according to the ancient writer Plutarch, She could speak with envoys from Ethiopia, from the deserts of Arabia, from Syria, from the mountains of Media, from Parthia, and from a dozen other nations, without ever once needing a translator standing between her and the person she was speaking to. Beyond languages, her education would almost certainly have included careful study of medicine and pharmacology, subjects that fascinated the Alexandrian scholarly tradition, where physicians had access to knowledge gathered from Greek, Egyptian, and even Indian medical traditions, all converging in the libraries and lecture halls of the city. Later in her life, ancient writers would describe Cleopatra as having written, or at least having overseen the compilation of, treatises on cosmetics, weights and measures, and medicinal remedies, evidence of a mind that treated knowledge itself as a form of power worth accumulating just as deliberately as soldiers or ships. She would have studied the great historical and political writings available in the library's vast collection, learning not only what her Ptolemaic ancestors had done right and wrong, but studying the rise and fall of other kingdoms entirely, absorbing lessons about diplomacy and warfare from Greek historians who had chronicled centuries of conflict between rival city-states and empires. Mini-story tone. Try to imagine what that would have looked like in practice. A foreign ambassador arrives at the Alexandrian court, expecting, as was completely normal in that era, to speak through a chain of interpreters. His words passed hand to hand like a relay race until they finally reach the ear of the monarch, and instead, the young queen looks directly at him and answers him, immediately, fluently, in his own native tongue, without a single interpreter in the room. It must have been disarming. It must have felt, to men who had spent their whole careers dealing with distant, untouchable royalty through layers of bureaucracy, like being seen for the very first time. That was Cleopatra's genius. And it was a genius she had clearly been cultivating since she was old enough to hold a scroll. But education alone does not prepare a child for what Cleopatra would go through before she ever took the throne. When she was still quite young, her father was driven out of Egypt entirely. The people of Alexandria, furious over his humiliating financial dependence on Rome and his crushing taxation to pay for it, rose up and forced him to flee the country. And one of Cleopatra's own sisters, a woman named Berenice, seized the vacant throne for herself. Auletes fled to Rome, and it is likely, though not entirely certain, that young Cleopatra traveled with him into that strange foreign exile, watching her father beg, bribe, and grovel his way through the corridors of Roman power, trying to buy back his own kingdom with money he did not have. Bold statement tone. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I think it explains more about Cleopatra's later life than almost anything else in her biography. She learned, as a child, watching her own father, exactly what it looked like for an Egyptian monarch to be powerless in front of Rome, to be laughed at, patronized, kept waiting in anterooms while lesser men decided her family's fate. And she made, I believe, a very deliberate decision very early in her life that this would never ever be her. She would not be a supplicant. She would find a way to be a partner, an equal, even a seductive and irresistible necessity to whichever Roman was powerful enough to matter, rather than a beggar at his door. During those months of exile in Rome, Auletes did whatever was necessary to secure Roman support for his restoration, including, based on what ancient sources tell us, arranging for the poisoning of the leader of a delegation of roughly 100 Alexandrian citizens who had traveled to Rome specifically to argue against his return, with several other members of that delegation murdered or bribed into silence before they could even present their case to the Senate, a scandal so brazen that it became the subject of a Roman criminal trial in its own right, one whose surviving records are actually one of our best windows into just how far Auletes was willing to go to hold on to his crown. Eventually, a Roman general named Gabinius, acting more or less on his own authority and in exchange for an enormous bribe, marched an army into Egypt and forcibly reinstalled Auletes on his throne. Among the young Roman officers who took part in that campaign was a dashing, hard-drinking cavalry commander named Mark Antony, then still in his 20s, a man whose path would not cross meaningfully with Cleopatra's for another 2 decades. but who nonetheless rode into Egypt for the first time as part of the very force that restored her father's crown. A small, strange thread of history connecting two lives that would one day become permanently intertwined. Julius did eventually get his throne back, through Roman military force paid for with yet more borrowed money and yet more promises he could barely keep, and Berenice, the sister who had usurped him, was executed for her rebellion. A grim homecoming gift for a father whose absence had taught his daughter more about the fragility of power than any tutor ever could. Cleopatra grew up in the years that followed, watching her father cling to a crown that Rome could take away from him at any moment, and when he finally died, in the year 51 before Christ, he left behind a will that set the stage for the entire rest of Cleopatra's life. He named Cleopatra, then about 18 years old, and her younger brother, a boy of roughly 10 named Ptolemy XIII, as joint rulers of Egypt, with instructions that, following the grim tradition of their house, the siblings would also marry one another to legitimize their shared reign. For a brief time, Cleopatra ruled alongside her child husband-brother, with what appears to have been genuine energy and ambition. She traveled the country. She was involved, unusually for a Ptolemaic monarch, in religious ceremonies with the native Egyptian priesthood, cultivating the image of herself not just as a Greek queen occupying an Egyptian throne, but as something closer to a living Egyptian goddess, deliberately associating herself with the goddess Isis, mother of the god Horus, protector and nurturer of kings. In her very first year on the throne, records suggest she traveled south to the ancient city of Hermonthis to participate in ceremonies honoring the installation of a new sacred Bukis bull, an animal revered in Egyptian religion as a living manifestation of the war god Montu, a ritual that Ptolemaic monarchs had traditionally left entirely to local priests to handle without royal involvement. Cleopatra's personal attention to a ceremony most of her predecessors would have considered beneath their notice sent an unmistakable message throughout the priestly class that governed so much of ordinary Egyptian religious and economic life, that this young queen intended to rule differently than her father and grandfather had. She also inherited a kingdom in the grip of a genuine agricultural crisis almost immediately upon taking the throne. A poor Nile flood combining with drought to threaten the harvest that all of Egypt depended on for survival. Ancient administrative records from these opening months of her reign are frustratingly incomplete, but the pattern of what survives, combined with what we know of how Ptolemaic monarchs typically responded to subsistence crises, suggests she was forced to involve herself directly and immediately in matters of grain supply and relief for her population, a level of hands-on administrative engagement that fits the broader picture of a young ruler determined to prove, from her very first months in power, that she intended to govern in fact and not merely in name. This was smart, calculated political theater, and it was exactly the kind of thing her ancestors had almost never bothered to do. But her brother's court was full of ambitious advisors, men who had no interest in sharing power with an intelligent, headstrong young woman who clearly intended to actually rule rather than simply exist as a ceremonial figurehead beside her little brother. Within a couple of years, these advisors maneuvered Cleopatra out of Alexandria entirely, and by the year 49 before Christ, she found herself in exile, much as her father had once been, forced to flee into Syria to gather what support and what soldiers she could, determined to fight her way back to the throne that was rightfully hers. This was no small undertaking for a young woman not yet 20 years old. Raising a mercenary army in the ancient world required money, contacts, and a reputation serious enough that hardened soldiers would agree to fight and possibly die on the promise of a queen's word rather than coin already in hand. Cleopatra spent months moving through the borderlands of the eastern Mediterranean, negotiating with local rulers, drawing on whatever loyalty her family's name still commanded in territories that had once belonged to the Ptolemaic Empire in more prosperous generations, slowly assembling a force she hoped would be strong enough to march back into Egypt and reclaim what her brother's court had stolen from her. By the time she had gathered her army near Egypt's eastern frontier, at a fortress town called Pelusium, her brother's forces were waiting for her on the other side, and Egypt stood on the brink of a civil war between siblings that might have dragged on for years, had history not, at that exact moment, delivered an entirely unexpected complication in the form of a defeated Roman general washing ashore on Egyptian soil. And this is where the story of Cleopatra intersects, suddenly and permanently, with the story of Rome itself, because at that exact moment, Rome was tearing itself apart in a civil war between two of the most famous men in its history. Julius Caesar, having crossed the river that would give us the phrase about no turning back, was locked in a desperate struggle for control of the entire Roman world against his former ally and now bitter rival, a general named Pompey. Caesar himself was, by this point in his life, a man in his early 50s, balding, famously vain about it, a brilliant general who had spent the better part of a decade conquering Gaul, writing his own detailed accounts of those campaigns that Roman readers devoured with fascination, and a political operator who had gambled everything on a single irreversible decision to march his army across a small river called the Rubicon and into Roman territory itself, an act that under Roman law amounted to a declaration of civil war against his own government. That gamble had paid off, at least so far. Pompey, after a crushing defeat at a battle fought in Greece, fled east, looking for refuge, and he chose Egypt, a kingdom his family had helped prop up for years, a kingdom whose own restoration under Auletes had depended in part on Pompey's political patronage back in Rome, believing the young Ptolemy would surely remember that debt and offer him sanctuary and support. Instead, the advisors surrounding the 13-year-old king made a cold, calculating decision. They decided that Pompey was a losing bet, and that the surest way to win favor with the victorious Caesar, who was certain to arrive in Egypt any day now in pursuit of his rival, was to present Caesar with Pompey's head as a gift. And so, as Pompey stepped off his boat onto the Egyptian shore, trusting that he was walking toward safety among old allies, he was murdered on the beach, and his severed head was preserved to be handed to Caesar like some grotesque offering of loyalty. It did not work the way Ptolemy's advisors expected. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and was presented with the head of his former friend, his former son-in-law, a man he had fought against but never stopped respecting as a Roman of great stature, he was reportedly horrified and disgusted rather than pleased. He wept, according to some accounts, at the sight of it, and Caesar, ever the shrewd political operator, saw immediately that the young king's court had badly miscalculated, and he saw an opportunity in that miscalculation. He installed himself in the royal palace at Alexandria, ostensibly to mediate the ongoing succession dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, but in reality to assert Roman authority directly over Egypt's affairs, and to collect the enormous debts still owed to Rome from the days of Auletes. Cleopatra, still in exile, still gathering her scattered forces outside the city, understood immediately what this meant. The most powerful man in the entire Roman world was sitting inside her own palace, and her brother's advisors controlled every gate, every guard, every checkpoint between her and him. If she tried to enter the city openly, she would almost certainly be captured or killed before she ever got near Caesar at all. So she devised a plan that has become one of the single most famous stories from the ancient world. A plan so bold and so theatrical that it tells you everything you need to know about who Cleopatra really was underneath all the education and the political calculation. Question hook, reflective tone, and I want you to really think about the nerve this required. What would you risk if you were 21 years old, exiled from your own home, and the only path back to power ran directly through the private chambers of a man you had never met, a man 52 years old, one of the most feared and celebrated generals in the history of the world? Under cover of darkness, Cleopatra had herself rolled up inside a large carpet, or, according to some ancient sources, a plain traveling sack used for carrying linens, and entrusted her own body, quite literally, to a single loyal servant named Apollodorus, who carried her, or rather carried the bundle that contained her, past the guards controlling the harbor, into a small boat, across the water under the cover of night, and into the royal palace itself, straight to the private quarters where Julius Caesar was staying. When the bundle was finally set down before him and unrolled, Caesar found himself staring not at a gift of fabric or linen, but at a young queen, disheveled from her journey but composed, intelligent, and utterly unafraid, looking him directly in the eye. We will never know exactly what was said in that room in the moments that followed, but we know the outcome with perfect clarity. Caesar was captivated. Whether it was her beauty, and ancient sources are actually surprisingly divided on how conventionally beautiful Cleopatra truly was, some describing her as merely pleasant-looking rather than a great beauty. Or whether it was simply the force of her intelligence, her wit, her sheer audacity in staging an entrance no one in the history of diplomacy had ever attempted before. Caesar decided, that very night, that he would back Cleopatra's claim to the throne over her brothers. This decision plunged Alexandria into open warfare. Ptolemy's advisors, and eventually Ptolemy himself, refused to accept Caesar's judgment, and the city descended into brutal urban fighting. Roman soldiers barricaded inside the palace complex against the far larger forces loyal to the young king. Caesar had arrived in Egypt with only a modest force, nowhere near enough to control a city of several 100,000 people if that city turned against him, and for months he found himself effectively under siege inside his own quarters, fighting street by street, rooftop by rooftop, for control of the harbor that was his only lifeline to reinforcements and supply. During this chaotic siege, a fire broke out near the harbor, deliberately set, according to most accounts, by Caesar's own men in a desperate effort to burn the Egyptian fleet at anchor before it could be used against them. The wind that night carried sparks and burning debris up from the docks toward the warehouses that lined the waterfront. And though historians still debate exactly how much damage it caused, ancient accounts describe flames spreading toward buildings near the Great Library itself, and some portion of that legendary collection of scrolls, built up over nearly 3 centuries of careful, obsessive acquisition, was lost forever in the smoke. An incalculable loss to human knowledge that still makes historians wince whenever they think about it. Urgent tone. Somewhere in that same city, behind palace walls now scarred by fighting, a young queen waited through months of uncertainty, knowing that her entire future, and quite possibly her life, depended on a small, exhausted Roman garrison managing to hold out against overwhelming numbers. The fighting dragged on for months, through the winter and into the following spring, until Roman reinforcements finally arrived by land and sea, marching up from the eastern frontier, and the forces loyal to the boy king were decisively crushed in the fighting that followed. Ptolemy XIII, still only about 13 or 14 years old, attempted to flee across the Nile in the chaos of the final collapse, and drowned in the process, his heavy ceremonial armor dragging him beneath the water, a strangely undignified end for a boy who had been born into a palace and had never known anything but the trappings of kingship. With her brother dead, Caesar restored Cleopatra to her throne, though, in keeping with Ptolemaic tradition, and perhaps also to maintain the appearance of shared rule rather than outright Roman-installed monarchy. She was formally married to her surviving younger brother, a boy of only about 11 years old, who became Ptolemy XIV in name only. In practice, everyone understood exactly who held the actual power in Egypt now, and it was not an 11-year-old figurehead. It was Cleopatra herself, backed by the unshakable protection of Julius Caesar, who lingered in Egypt for months after the fighting ended, officially attending to administrative matters, but by every account also deeply, genuinely involved with the young queen who had so boldly won his attention. The two of them reportedly took a long, leisurely voyage together up the Nile River, traveling aboard a magnificent royal barge fitted with colonnades, banquet halls, and gardens on its upper deck, trailed by a flotilla of Roman warships as escort. It was a journey that served both as a political tour, allowing Cleopatra to be seen and celebrated by her Egyptian subjects alongside her powerful Roman protector, sailing past temples that had stood for 1,000 years before either of them was born, past farmers working fields that flooded and receded with the same rhythm they had followed since before the pyramids were built, and as something far more personal, a honeymoon of sorts between two of the most extraordinary political minds of their generation, an aging Roman general who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon, and a young queen who had just clawed her way back onto a throne that had nearly been stolen from her forever. Along the way, Cleopatra made sure to be seen not merely as a Greek monarch borrowing Roman muscle, but increasingly as the living embodiment of Isis herself, the great mother goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, wife of Osiris and mother of Horus, a goddess associated with magic, healing, and the fierce protection of kingship. She appeared before her people in the traditional dress associated with Isis, and temple inscriptions from this period increasingly describe her in language usually reserved for the divine. This was not empty vanity, it was calculated statecraft of the highest order, binding the loyalty of ordinary Egyptians, people who had spent nearly 3 centuries watching a foreign Greek family rule over them, with only occasional interest in their native traditions, to a queen who now, deliberately and visibly, presented herself as one of their own gods walking among them. In the year 47 before Christ, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, though history would come to know him almost universally by the affectionate nickname Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. She made absolutely no secret of who the father was, commissioning a relief carved into the wall of a temple at her Monthis, showing herself in the act of giving birth, attended by Egyptian gods. Caesarion presented to the divine assembly as a legitimate royal heir in the oldest visual language Egypt possessed, a language of stone and symbol that had been used to legitimize pharaohs for nearly 3,000 years before Cleopatra herself was born. This claim would go on to become one of the most politically explosive facts of her entire life, because Julius Caesar, back in Rome, had no legitimate son of his own, only a daughter who had already died in childbirth years earlier, and an adopted great-nephew named Octavian, who would one day become the single most important rival Cleopatra would ever face. Bold statement tone. A son fathered by the most powerful man in the Roman world, raised as a pharaoh of Egypt, carrying both the blood of Alexander's conquering general and the blood of Rome's greatest statesman, was not merely a personal joy for Cleopatra. It was, whether she fully grasped the danger of it in that first joyful moment of motherhood or not, a claim that placed her son on a collision course with anyone in Rome who had ambitions of their own for Caesar's legacy. For now, though, Caesarion was simply a source of joy and enormous political leverage, living proof of a bond between Egypt's queen and Rome's most powerful man, a bond Cleopatra intended to make sure the entire world understood clearly. In the year 46 before Christ, Cleopatra traveled to Rome itself, bringing along her young son and her nominal husband-brother, and settled into a lavish villa that Caesar owned across the river from the city center. Caesar, showing an almost reckless disregard for how this would be perceived by his fellow Romans, made no effort at all to hide his devotion to her. He commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra, portraying her in the guise of the goddess Venus, and placed it inside a temple he had built in the Roman Forum itself. A temple dedicated to Venus as the divine ancestor of his own family line. A temple built with the spoils of his own military conquests as a monument to his family's supposed descent from the goddess of love herself. This meant that Roman citizens walking through the very heart of their own republic, past the law courts and the speaker's platform where centuries of political life had unfolded, found themselves face to face with the golden image of a foreign queen, elevated to the status of a goddess, standing inside one of the most sacred spaces in the entire city. An image that later Roman writers would cite for generations as proof of exactly how far Caesar's ambition and his infatuation had carried him beyond the bounds of what a Roman statesman was supposed to be. Vulnerability tone. It is worth pausing here to imagine how isolating this must have felt for Cleopatra, even at the height of her power and prestige. She was a foreign monarch in a city that viewed foreign monarchs, and especially foreign queens, with deep suspicion and often outright contempt. Rome, at this point in its history, was still officially a republic, deeply proud of having thrown out its own kings some 4.5 centuries earlier, and deeply suspicious of any single man, let alone any foreign woman. Accumulating power that looked even remotely royal. Roman writers of the period, and for generations afterward, would use her presence in the city as a symbol of Eastern decadence corrupting Roman virtue, painting her as a dangerous, exotic seductress rather than the accomplished ruler and administrator she actually was back home in Alexandria. Senators whispered that Caesar meant to move the capital of the Roman world to Alexandria itself, that he intended to make himself a king with Cleopatra as his queen, ruling not as a Roman magistrate answerable to the Senate, but as an Eastern-style monarch answerable to no one. Whether or not Caesar ever seriously entertained such an idea, the mere rumor of it was enough to poison the political atmosphere of the city against her. She had left behind a kingdom she governed with genuine skill, a bureaucracy she personally understood down to the level of grain shipments and tax collection, and here in Rome she was reduced, in the eyes of many, to little more than Caesar's foreign mistress, gossiped about, resented, watched with narrowed eyes by senators who worried, not without reason, about exactly how much influence she held over the most powerful man in their world. She could walk through the forum surrounded by attendants and still feel, one imagines, entirely alone, a queen in her own right reduced by a foreign city's gossip to something smaller than she actually was. And then, on the 15th of March, in the year 44 before Christ, a date that would echo through more than 2,000 years of history as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, everything collapsed. Julius Caesar arrived at a meeting of the Senate that morning, reportedly having ignored several warnings, including one from his own wife who had dreamed of his death the night before, and was surrounded by a group of senators pretending to petition him about some matter of state. As he waved away the first blow, thinking it a mere scuffle, more than 20 conspirators closed in around him, each one, according to tradition, driving a blade into his body, an act designed so that responsibility for the killing would be shared equally among all of them, so that no single man could be named the murderer, and every man who wished to see the Republic saved could claim a hand in saving it. He fell at the base of a statue of his old rival Pompey, the very man whose severed head had once been presented to him on an Egyptian beach. A coincidence of history so strange that later writers could not resist pointing it out. The men who killed him believed they were rescuing the Roman Republic from a man they feared, intended to make himself a king in all but name, and in the immediate aftermath, chaos gripped the city, citizens fleeing the forum, rumors spreading faster than any official announcement could keep pace with. Cleopatra, still in Rome at the time, understood immediately the extraordinary danger of her position. The man whose protection had shielded her, whose relationship had given her both political legitimacy and profound personal significance, was dead, murdered by the very institution she had been living among for months. Caesar's will was read publicly shortly afterward, and it contained no mention of Caesarion at all. Instead, Caesar had named his young great-nephew, a sickly 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius, as his adopted son and principal heir, a young man who would very soon take the name Octavian, and who would spend the rest of Cleopatra's life as her most determined and ultimately most successful enemy. Cleopatra did not linger in a city that had suddenly become extremely dangerous for her. She gathered her son and her household and sailed back to Egypt as quickly as she could, arriving home to a kingdom that, in her absence, had been struggling through drought and a catastrophically poor Nile flood, conditions that threatened famine among her people on a scale not seen in generations. The Nile's annual flood was not a minor agricultural inconvenience in the ancient world. It was the single event upon which the entire survival of the Egyptian population depended, and when the river failed to rise high enough, granaries emptied, food prices soared beyond what ordinary families could afford, and unrest simmered dangerously close to the surface in a kingdom that had already endured years of political instability. Cleopatra returned to a throne room, in other words, that offered her no gentle homecoming, no peaceful transition back into power after the trauma of watching Caesar murdered in front of her adopted city. She returned instead to a kingdom on the edge of genuine crisis, and she had to govern through it immediately, decisively, and largely alone. With the one man whose protection had shielded her for the past 4 years now lying dead in a tomb outside Rome. Not long after her return, her young brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, by then a teenager of perhaps 15, who had spent his entire brief reign as nothing more than a name on official documents, while his sister actually governed, died suddenly and without any recorded illness beforehand. While we can never know with absolute certainty, since no ancient source left behind a confession or a court record, most historians who study this period believe it is extremely likely that Cleopatra had him quietly poisoned, removing a technically legitimate rival claimant to the throne at the exact moment she needed to clear an uncontested path for her true heir. It was a cold, calculated act, if it happened the way most historians suspect, one that would fit perfectly within the long, brutal tradition of her family, the same family that had turned fratricide into something closer to a governing philosophy than a crime, and one that cleared the way, deliberately and finally, for her true purpose. With her brother gone, Cleopatra elevated her 3-year-old son Caesarion to the position of co-ruler beside her, giving him the formal title Ptolemy XV. In the eyes of Cleopatra, and in the eyes of Egypt, the son of Julius Caesar now sat, however symbolically at his age, upon the throne of the pharaohs, a living, breathing claim that the bloodline of the most famous man in Roman history now flowed through an Egyptian heir. It was an audacious, dangerous assertion to make, especially with Caesar's adopted son Octavian very much alive and watching from Rome, a young man barely out of his teenage years, physically frail, often sick, and yet possessed of a cold, patient political instinct that would prove, in time, to be far more dangerous than any battlefield general Cleopatra had ever encountered. Back in Rome, in the years immediately following Caesar's murder, the city plunged once again into the kind of chaos it had known so many times before. Caesar's assassins, who had expected to be hailed as heroes for saving the Republic, instead found themselves fleeing the city as public sympathy swung hard in the murdered dictator's favor, stirred up in large part by a passionate, furious funeral oration delivered by Caesar's loyal general and ally, a battle-hardened, charismatic man named Mark Antony, who had fought alongside Caesar for years, and who now positioned himself as the natural inheritor of Caesar's political power in Rome. But Antony soon found himself in an uneasy, suspicious rivalry with young Octavian, Caesar's chosen heir by adoption. A rivalry that briefly erupted into open conflict before the two men, along with a third general named Lepidus, recognized that neither of them alone was strong enough to control Rome, and struck an uneasy alliance known to history as the Second Triumvirate. Together, the three men hunted down Caesar's assassins and crushed them in battle, avenging their fallen leader, and then divided the vast Roman world between themselves like men carving up an inheritance. Antony took for himself the wealthy, cultured provinces of the East, the very regions bordering Cleopatra's own kingdom, regions where Rome's authority depended heavily on cooperation, tribute, and alliance from local client rulers exactly like the Queen of Egypt herself. Antony arrived in the East already carrying a considerable reputation, part brilliant cavalry officer who had proven his courage on more than one battlefield, part notorious reveler known throughout Rome for his enormous appetite for wine, food, and pleasure, a big, physically imposing man who styled himself, half in jest and half in genuine belief, as a descendant of the demigod Hercules. He needed money desperately to pay the soldiers under his command and to fund an ambitious military campaign he was already planning against the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east. A campaign he hoped would cement his own military glory to rival anything Caesar had ever achieved. And there was no wealthier, more strategically vital ally in the entire eastern Mediterranean than Egypt. A kingdom whose grain shipments fed cities across the Roman world, and whose treasury, despite years of financial strain, still dwarfed almost anything else in the region. And so, as Cleopatra settled back into her palace in Alexandria, rebuilding her kingdom after years of drought and war, raising her young son beneath the same colonnades and gardens where she herself had once studied languages and philosophy as a child, and watching the political winds shifting once again across the Mediterranean, a new and formidable Roman general was making his way east, moving from city to city collecting tribute, favors, and alliances as he went, a man whose path, sooner rather than later, was destined to cross with hers. She had already proven, through exile, through war, through the loss of a protector she had loved, that she was not a woman who waited passively for history to happen to her. Whatever this next Roman general wanted from Egypt, and whatever Egypt might need from him in return, Cleopatra intended to make certain that when they finally met face to face, it would be on her terms, staged by her own design, exactly as it had been the first time she ever entered a powerful Roman's private chambers rolled inside a carpet. That meeting was coming, and when it finally arrived, it would change the course of her story, and the course of history itself, forever. In the spring of the year 41 before Christ, a messenger arrived in Alexandria carrying a summons that Cleopatra could not ignore. Mark Antony, now the master of Rome's eastern provinces following the division of power that had followed Caesar's assassination and the defeat of Caesar's killers at the Battle of Philippi, had set up his headquarters in the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, and he wanted Egypt's queen brought before him to answer a serious accusation that she had secretly sent aid to the men who had assassinated Julius Caesar during their doomed campaign against the triumvirate. The accusation was almost certainly baseless, more a matter of political posturing and an opportunity to assert Roman authority over a wealthy client kingdom than any genuine suspicion of wrongdoing. But that hardly mattered. Antony held the power in this relationship, at least on paper, and every other client monarch in the region understood that when a Roman triumvir summoned you to explain yourself, you came, and you came prepared to beg for forgiveness, regardless of whether you had actually done anything wrong. It was, on the surface, a summons that placed Cleopatra in the position of a subject called to account by her master, exactly the kind of humiliating posture her father had once been forced into, groveling before Roman power with no leverage of her own. Urgent tone. But Cleopatra had spent her entire life learning that the appearance of power and the reality of power were two very different things, and she understood, perhaps better than any monarch of her generation, that the way you walk into a room can matter just as much as anything you say once you're inside it. She did not travel to Tarsus quickly, and she did not travel humbly. Instead, she took her time, allowing rumors of her approach to spread and build anticipation throughout the city, and when she finally arrived, she did not disembark like an ordinary traveler at all. She sailed her royal barge directly up the Cydnus River toward the heart of Tarsus itself, a vessel with a gilded stern and purple sails so distinctive that they could be seen from a great distance. Its oars tipped with silver that flashed in the sunlight with every stroke, moving to the rhythm of flutes and harps drifting across the water. Mini story tone. Picture the scene the people of Tarsus actually witnessed that day. Word spread through the marketplace and up through the streets that something extraordinary was approaching by river, and crowds abandoned whatever they had been doing. pouring down toward the water's edge until Antony himself, seated on a raised platform in the city square, waiting to receive the queen as a summoned subject, found himself sitting almost entirely alone, his own attendants having wandered off to join the throng gathering along the riverbank. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy embroidered with gold thread, dressed in the guise of the goddess Aphrodite, fanned by young boys costumed as cupids, attended by women dressed as sea nymphs, who worked the rigging and the rudder as though the goddess of love herself had decided to make an appearance in the mortal world. Word raced ahead of her into the city that Aphrodite had come to feast with Dionysus for the good of all Asia. A deliberate piece of theater aimed directly at Antony, who had spent years cultivating his own public image as a living incarnation of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, ecstasy, and abundance. It worked exactly as she intended. Rather than Cleopatra coming to answer for herself before Antony as a subject before her judge, it was Antony who found himself sending an invitation to dinner aboard her barge, and Cleopatra, in a small but unmistakable assertion of who actually held the upper hand in this encounter, declined his invitation and insisted that he come to her instead. He did. Bold statement tone. In a single afternoon, without raising an army or signing a treaty. Cleopatra had managed to completely invert the entire premise of why she had been summoned in the first place, transforming an interrogation into a courtship, and by the time that first dinner was over, whatever accusations had originally brought her to Tarsus seemed to have evaporated entirely from the historical record, never mentioned again by either party. Antony followed her back to Alexandria that winter, and what followed was a season of extravagance that Roman writers would spend the rest of their careers gossiping about and moralizing over. Antony himself was by this point in his life a man in his early 40s, physically imposing, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, with a reputation for enormous physical strength and an equally enormous appetite for wine, food, and revelry. He liked to claim descent from the demigod Hercules, and he cultivated a public image built around raw physical vitality and larger-than-life indulgence, an image that made him beloved among his soldiers, who saw him as one of them rather than a distant aristocrat. But that also made him an easy target for Roman moralists eager to paint him as a man ruled entirely by his appetites rather than his judgment. Cleopatra and Antony formed what they called, half-jokingly, a society of inimitable livers, a loose fellowship of nobles and hangers-on dedicated to a life of feasting, drinking, hunting, and games. Ancient accounts describe absurd, staggering quantities of food prepared for their banquets, entire roasted boars served not because dozens of guests were expected, but because the cooks had to time the roasting perfectly to whichever hour Antony happened to feel like eating, meaning that 8 boars might be turning on 8 separate spits at 8 staggered stages of doneness, just so that dinner would be ready the instant he called for it, no matter how late. They reportedly wandered the streets of Alexandria at night in disguise, dressed as ordinary commoners, seeking out mischief and adventure with the kind of reckless, unguarded delight that neither of them, as reigning monarchs and triumvirs, could ever afford to show in daylight. Reflective tone. It is tempting to read all of this simply as decadence, as the ancient Roman moralists certainly wanted their readers to. But there is another way to read it too. A more human way. Here were 2 of the most powerful, most watched, most burdened people in the entire Mediterranean world, each carrying responsibilities that would crush most people, and for one winter. In the privacy of a city they controlled completely, they found a way to simply be a man and a woman enjoying each other's company, wearing the costume of ordinary people, because the costume of royalty never came off otherwise. By the time winter ended and Antony's duties called him away, Cleopatra was pregnant. In the following year she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, meaning the sun and the moon, names dripping with the kind of cosmic dynastic symbolism the Ptolemies had always favored. suggesting children destined to illuminate the eastern and western halves of the known world, a not-so-subtle statement of ambition disguised as a simple naming ceremony for two newborn infants. Antony, however, was not there to witness their birth. Political troubles back in Rome demanded his attention, chief among them a rebellion stirred up in Italy partly by his own wife Fulvia and his brother, apparently in an attempt to draw Antony's focus away from his growing entanglement with Cleopatra and back toward his responsibilities and his family in Rome. Fulvia died before Antony could resolve the situation with her directly, and in the aftermath, to repair the badly strained relationship with his fellow triumvir Octavian, Antony agreed to marry Octavian's own sister, a widow named Octavia, a woman ancient writers describe as intelligent, dignified, and genuinely virtuous. Someone who by all accounts deserved far better than the marriage she was about to endure. The marriage was, from its very first day, a piece of political architecture rather than a romance, sealing an uneasy truce between two men who had come dangerously close to open war with one another, and Rome celebrated it as such. A hopeful symbol that the endless cycle of Roman civil conflict might finally be drawing to a close now that its two most powerful surviving men were bound together by family as well as by treaty. For a while, this arrangement actually seemed to work. Antony spent several years largely apart from Cleopatra, occupied with the administration of Rome's eastern territories, and with Octavia, who bore him two daughters, and who, on at least one occasion, personally intervened to smooth over tensions between her husband and her brother, brokering a renewal of the triumvirate's authority when it was on the verge of collapsing. But Antony had ambitions that a marriage alliance alone could never satisfy. He wanted what Julius Caesar himself had once dreamed of achieving, a decisive military triumph over the Parthian Empire, Rome's great unconquered rival to the east. The same power that had annihilated a Roman army under the general Crassus in a catastrophic defeat that still haunted Roman military pride decades later. To fund and staff a campaign of the scale he envisioned, Antony needed resources far beyond what Octavian, increasingly reluctant to strengthen his rival, was willing to provide. And so, in the year 37 before Christ, Antony sent for Cleopatra once again, this time summoning her to the city of Antioch, and this reunion marked, in the eyes of most historians who study this period, the true beginning of a lasting partnership between them, one that would never again be interrupted by a return to Octavia or to Rome. At Antioch, Cleopatra brought with her the 3-year-old twins Antony had never yet seen, and by most accounts this was the first time father and children ever laid eyes on one another, a moment surely charged with the strange mixture of pride, guilt, and wonder that comes with meeting your own child for the first time years into their life. And it was reportedly at this meeting that the twins were formally given their solar and lunar surnames, Helios and Selene, as part of a carefully choreographed piece of dynastic propaganda meant to signal that Antony and Cleopatra together intended to rule over a new age of the Eastern world. In exchange for the enormous financial and material support Egypt could provide toward the coming Parthian campaign, Antony granted Cleopatra significant new territories, expanding her kingdom's reach along the eastern Mediterranean coast in a way no Ptolemaic ruler had managed in generations, restoring to her control large portions of Phoenicia, parts of Cilicia, the island of Cyprus, and a lucrative stretch of the Judean coastline prized for its valuable balsam groves. It was here, too, that Cleopatra likely became pregnant with a third child, a son she would eventually name Ptolemy Philadelphus. The Parthian campaign that followed, launched in the summer of the year 36 before Christ, was meant to be the crowning achievement of Antony's military career, the triumph that would place him on equal footing with Julius Caesar's own legendary conquests in Gaul, and would finally avenge the catastrophic Roman defeat suffered at Carrhae nearly 2 decades earlier, when a Roman army under the general Crassus had been annihilated so thoroughly that captured Roman military standards still sat, humiliatingly in Parthian hands. Antony marched an enormous force, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 soldiers, north through Armenia and into the Parthian territory of Media Atropatene, hoping to strike quickly at the regional capital before Parthian forces could organize an effective defense. Urgent tone, but haste proved to be his undoing. In his eagerness to move fast, Antony left his heavy siege engines and supply train traveling separately under a smaller guard commanded by an officer named Oppius Statianus, and Parthian cavalry, moving with a speed and coordination that Roman infantry simply could not match, fell upon that lightly defended baggage train and destroyed it completely, killing thousands of the soldiers guarding it and wiping out the very equipment Antony needed to actually breach the walls of his target city. Without siege engines, the campaign stalled into a fruitless standoff outside the fortified capital, and as autumn approached and supplies dwindled, Antony was forced into a brutal, punishing retreat back toward friendly territory, harassed at nearly every step by Parthian raiders who picked off stragglers, ambushed foraging parties, and forced the Roman column into defensive formations again and again across nearly 3 weeks of fighting. Plutarch recording as many as 18 separate engagements during that single grueling month-long march. By the time the surviving remnant of his army finally reached the safety of Armenia and then Syria, Antony had lost somewhere between 1/4 and 2/5 of the massive force he had marched out with only months before. The vast majority of those losses coming not from battle itself, but from starvation, exposure, and the bitter cold of a winter retreat through mountainous terrain never meant to be crossed at that time of year. It was a devastating blow to Antony's reputation and his military standing, and in the aftermath, he retreated once again into Cleopatra's care, both literally and emotionally, wintering with her in Alexandria while his shattered army recovered. When Octavia, still technically his wife, learned of the disaster, she set out from Rome with fresh troops, supplies, and money to help him rebuild his forces, an act of genuine loyalty and devotion that history has generally judged rather kindly. Vulnerability tone. And it is worth pausing here to consider Octavia for a moment, a woman who by every surviving account behaved with extraordinary grace and patience throughout a marriage that had never truly been about her at all, a political arrangement from the very beginning that she nonetheless tried sincerely to make work. When she reached Athens, Antony sent word that she should turn back, that her assistance, while welcome in the form of soldiers and supplies, was no longer wanted in the form of her personal presence. It was a humiliation delivered at a distance, cold and impersonal, and Octavia, left with no real choice, returned to Rome alone, continuing for years afterward to raise Antony's children, including the ones he had fathered with Cleopatra, inside her own household. An act of dignity that stands in stark contrast to almost everything else happening around her. Antony did eventually salvage something from the wreckage of his eastern ambitions. In the year 34 before Christ, he launched a successful campaign against the kingdom of Armenia, whose king he blamed, fairly or not, for contributing to the Parthian disaster, and he returned to Alexandria with genuine spoils and a captured king to parade through the streets, staging a triumphal procession that mimicked, in almost every detail, the sacred victory celebrations that Roman tradition reserved exclusively for the city of Rome itself. Shocking fact tone. And here is where Antony made what many historians consider the single most catastrophic political miscalculation of his entire career. Rather than simply celebrating this modest military success and leaving it there, he staged an enormous public ceremony in the Gymnasium of Alexandria before a crowd of thousands, seating himself and Cleopatra on twin silver-plated thrones, raised on a high platform, with their children arranged on 4 smaller thrones at their feet. The captured Armenian king was marched before the assembled crowd in golden chains, forced to bow, though he reportedly refused to prostrate himself fully even under threat, a small act of defiance that Roman writers noted with a certain grudging respect. And then, in front of the assembled crowd, Antony formally redrew the political map of the entire eastern Mediterranean. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and named her son Caesarion, now a boy of about 13, King of Kings and the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar himself, dressed for the occasion in the traditional garb of the Egyptian god Horus. He granted the young twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene dominion over Armenia, Media, and territories stretching as far as Parthia. Lands Rome did not even fully control, dressing Alexander himself in the flowing robes and tall cap of an Iranian prince to visually announce his new eastern inheritance, and he gave his youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, still a toddler barely 2 years old, nominal rule over Syria, Phoenicia, and Cilicia. This ceremony, which came to be known as the Donations of Alexandria, was staged with all the trappings of Egyptian and Greek royal ritual, Antony appearing in the guise of the god Dionysus, Cleopatra as the goddess Isis, their children dressed in the traditional costumes of the very kingdoms they had just been granted. Bold statement tone. Back in Rome, the reaction was every bit as explosive as it should have been obvious it would be. Antony had just publicly announced, in a foreign city dressed as a foreign god, that he intended to carve up Roman-controlled territory and hand it to the children of a foreign queen, one of whom he was now openly claiming was the true heir of Julius Caesar, rather than Caesar's own legally adopted son, Octavian. It was, in the eyes of nearly every Roman who heard the news, an act bordering on treason, and Octavian, ever the shrewd political operator, seized upon it with both hands. Octavian spent the following months waging a masterful campaign of propaganda against his rival, portraying Antony not as a Roman general who had made questionable decisions, but as a man who had been utterly transformed, corrupted, and enslaved by a foreign sorceress queen. A man who had abandoned his loyal Roman wife for a life of Eastern decadence, who intended to move the very capital of Roman civilization from Rome itself to Alexandria, who had betrayed everything it meant to be Roman for the sake of a woman Octavian's propagandists painted as a dangerous, scheming seductress, rather than the accomplished administrator and diplomat she actually was. Octavian framed the entire coming conflict as a struggle between Roman virtue, embodied in the sober, dutiful god Apollo, whom he claimed as his own personal patron, and Eastern corruption, embodied in the wine-soaked excess of Dionysus that Antony had so publicly embraced, a narrative simple enough for ordinary Roman citizens to grasp and repeat, and devastatingly effective precisely because of that simplicity. When Antony, at Cleopatra's urging, sent Octavia a formal declaration of divorce in the year 32 before Christ, finally and publicly ending a marriage that had existed in name only for years, it confirmed every fear Octavian had been stoking in the Roman public, and it gave him the political cover to make his final, decisive move. Antony's will was kept, according to Roman custom, in the safekeeping of the Vestal Virgins in Rome, and Octavian, in an act that violated sacred religious law and every principle of decency, demanded the document be handed over to him. The Vestals refused to give it to him voluntarily, but told him that if he wished to simply take it by force, they would not physically stop him. Urgent tone. So he took it. He walked into one of the most sacred spaces in all of Rome and seized a private document that had absolutely no business being read by anyone until after its author's death, and he brought it before the Senate and read it aloud to the assembled body, selectively highlighting the passages most damaging to Antony's reputation. The will confirmed that Antony recognized Caesarion as the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. It confirmed the territorial grants made at the Donations of Alexandria, and most damning of all in Roman eyes, it stated that Antony wished, even if he died in Rome itself, to be carried to Alexandria and buried there beside Cleopatra, rather than resting among his own people in his own homeland. That single detail, more than almost anything else in the entire propaganda war, turned Roman public opinion decisively against him. To a deeply patriotic Roman audience, The idea that one of their own triumvirs would rather spend eternity in a foreign tomb beside a foreign queen than be laid to rest in Roman soil felt like the ultimate confirmation of everything Octavian had been claiming. That Antony was no longer truly Roman at all, that he had given his loyalty entirely to Egypt and to the woman who ruled it. Octavian, brilliantly, refused to ask the Senate to declare war on Antony directly, understanding that many Romans still respected Antony as a genuine war hero and would balk at another civil war between two Roman citizens. Instead, he asked the Senate to declare war on Cleopatra, framing the coming conflict not as Roman against Roman, but as Rome defending itself against a foreign queen and the Eastern decadence she represented. The Senate agreed, and in the year 32 before Christ, war was formally declared. A war that everyone understood was truly aimed at Antony, but which allowed Octavian to present himself, and the entire coming conflict, as a patriotic defense of Roman values rather than another exhausting round of civil bloodshed. Cleopatra insisted on personally participating in the military campaign that followed, over the strong objections of several of Antony's own advisors, who worried, correctly as it turned out, that her visible presence would only reinforce Octavian's propaganda that Antony had become nothing more than a puppet serving a foreign queen's ambitions. One of Antony's senior officers, a man named Domitius Ahenobarbus, argued forcefully that Cleopatra should be sent home before the fighting began, worried about exactly the kind of propaganda victory her presence might hand to Octavian, while another officer, Publius Canidius Crassus, countered that she was funding the entire war effort and had proven herself, over 2 decades of rule, to be a genuinely competent monarch who deserved a voice in decisions affecting her own kingdom's fate. But Cleopatra's argument carried weight too. Egypt was funding a massive share of the war effort, providing ships, money, and supplies that Antony's forces desperately needed, and she reasonably judged that by helping block Octavian's advance in Greece. She could keep the fighting as far from Egypt's own borders as possible. Some of Antony's most senior Roman officers, uncomfortable serving under a campaign so visibly entangled with a foreign monarch, defected to Octavian's side rather than continue, a slow bleeding of support that weakened Antony's position even before the two sides ever met in decisive battle. That decisive battle came on the 2nd of September, in the year 31 before Christ, near a promontory on the western coast of Greece called Actium. Antony commanded a fleet of large, heavily built warships, powerful but slow and difficult to maneuver, crewed in many cases by soldiers pressed into service as rowers, because disease and desertion had already thinned his ranks of experienced sailors. While Octavian's admiral, a brilliant and relentless commander named Marcus Agrippa, had assembled a fleet of smaller, faster, more agile vessels crewed by experienced sailors, supported by innovative weapons designed specifically to grapple and disable larger enemy ships from a distance, a device called the harpax that could be fired like a harpoon into an enemy hull and then winched tight to drag the vessel within boarding range. In the months leading up to the battle, Agrippa had already systematically cut off Antony's supply lines along the Greek coastline, seizing key harbors one by one and starving Antony's forces of the food and reinforcements they needed, so that by the time the two fleets finally met in open water, disease and hunger had already weakened Antony's crews before a single arrow was ever loosed. Some ancient accounts suggest that Antony and Cleopatra's council of advisors was sharply divided in the days before the battle, some urging a retreat by land back toward Egypt to fight another day, others insisting that a naval engagement, however risky, was the only option left that preserved any hope of breaking Octavian's blockade, and Cleopatra herself is said to have argued forcefully in favor of trusting the fleet, since Egypt's navy was, after all, the single greatest asset she personally controlled. The battle itself unfolded across a long, grinding afternoon, both sides maneuvering for advantage in the strait leading out into open sea, neither able to achieve a quick, decisive breakthrough. For hours, the two fleets pressed against one another in a chaotic, sprawling engagement, ships colliding and grappling, oars snapping under the pressure of tangled hulls. Soldiers on the heavy fighting towers built into Antony's larger vessels raining down arrows and spears onto the smaller, more nimble ships that darted around them, unable to land a single decisive blow against Agrippa's superior numbers and coordination. Urgent tone. And then, in the middle of the fighting, something happened that has puzzled and fascinated historians for 2,000 years. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships, which had been held in reserve behind Antony's main battle line, suddenly raised their sails and broke away from the fighting entirely, cutting directly through a gap in the chaos and sailing hard for open water and ultimately for Egypt. Question hook, mysterious tone. Why did she do it? Historians have debated this question for centuries without ever reaching a satisfying consensus. Some argue it was cowardice, a queen who saw the battle turning against them and chose self-preservation over loyalty. Others argue it was actually the plan all along, that Antony and Cleopatra had privately agreed from the very beginning that if the battle seemed unwinnable, breaking through with the treasury ships intact mattered more than continuing a doomed fight, since gold and a surviving fleet could still buy time, allies, and options, while a total destruction of every ship at Actium would leave them with absolutely nothing. Still others point to a simpler, more human explanation, that the winds shifted at exactly the wrong moment for her heavier ships to hold formation, and that what looked to observers on both sides like a deliberate, dramatic flight may actually have been a desperate tactical maneuver gone wrong, later reshaped by storytellers on all sides into something far more theatrical than what actually happened in the smoke and confusion of the fighting. What we know for certain is what happened next. When Antony saw Cleopatra's ships pulling away, he abandoned his own command vessel in the middle of the battle and followed her, transferring to a smaller, faster ship and chasing after her fleet with roughly 40 of his own vessels, leaving the rest of his massive fleet still actively fighting. Without its commander. Bold statement tone. It is hard to overstate how strange and how consequential this decision was. Whatever loyalty, love, or shared strategic calculation drove Antony to abandon his own battle line in the middle of an active engagement, the effect on the men he left behind was catastrophic, without their commander. And watching him flee alongside the queen many of them already resented, the remainder of Antony's fleet lost heart, and after further fighting, surrendered to Octavian. His land forces, encamped nearby and equally abandoned, held out for about a week before they too gave up and joined Octavian's side. Antony and Cleopatra made it back to Egypt, but the defeat at Actium had broken the back of their military power beyond any realistic hope of recovery. Reflective tone. The months that followed have an almost unbearable quality of watching a slow-motion ending unfold. Two people who had once commanded armies and redrawn the map of the Eastern world, now reduced to waiting, negotiating, and hoping for options that were quietly closing off one by one. For a brief period, Antony withdrew almost entirely from public life, reportedly building himself a small retreat on a breakwater in the harbor and living there in near isolation, avoiding company altogether, a man trying to come to terms with the scale of what had just been lost. They dissolved their old society of inimitable livers and formed a new one, grimmer in tone, which they called the Companions to the Death, a small circle of loyal friends who had resolved, at least in name, to face whatever ending was coming together rather than scatter and flee. Cleopatra, meanwhile, threw herself into a frantic search for any remaining option that might preserve her throne, or at least her children's futures, exploring whether her fleet, or what remained of it, might be able to drag her ships overland across the isthmus, separating the Mediterranean from the Red Sea, escaping toward the east entirely, and starting some new kingdom far beyond Octavian's reach, a plan abandoned only when Arab tribes in the region, at the instigation of a Roman governor, burned the ships before the plan could be carried out. According to several ancient accounts, Cleopatra spent time during this period testing the effects of various poisons on condemned prisoners, searching for a method of death that would be swift and free of visible suffering. a grim, methodical preparation for an outcome she seems to have accepted as increasingly likely. Octavian pursued them methodically through the following year, securing Roman territories along the way and rejecting every attempt Cleopatra made to negotiate favorable terms, whether through gifts of gold, offers of abdication in favor of her children, or any other diplomatic overture she could devise. Antony, for his part, sent his own separate appeals to Octavian, at one point sending his own son by an earlier marriage, along with a sum of money and an offer to simply retire from public life entirely, living out his remaining years as an ordinary private citizen in Athens or in Egypt, if Octavian would only agree to spare him and leave Cleopatra's throne intact for her children. An offer Octavian ignored entirely, since he had no intention of leaving any surviving thread of Ptolemaic or Caesarian legitimacy standing once his victory was complete. By the summer of the year 30 before Christ, Octavian's forces had reached the outskirts of Alexandria itself, advancing along two fronts, one column marching in from the eastern frontier fortress of Pelusium, which fell with suspicious speed, leading some ancient writers to suggest, probably unfairly, that Cleopatra herself had ordered its surrender in a final bid to curry favor with the approaching Roman army. Antony managed one final small victory in a skirmish outside the city, a brief flicker of the military talent that had once made him one of Rome's most feared commanders, his cavalry actually driving back Octavian's forces in a surprise sally from the city walls that briefly rekindled something like hope among his remaining soldiers, but it changed nothing in the end. On the 1st of August, his remaining fleet and cavalry defected to Octavian without a fight, and his infantry was defeated soon after. Alexandria, the glittering capital that had stood as the intellectual and political heart of the Hellenistic world for nearly 3 centuries, was effectively defenseless. Cleopatra withdrew into a mausoleum she had constructed for herself on the palace grounds, sealing herself inside along with her most valuable treasures and her 2 closest attendants, a maidservant named Irus and another named Charmion, determined that if Octavian wanted her treasury, he would have to accept it might be destroyed along with her, rather than paraded through Rome as spoils of war. She sent word to Antony that she had already died, whether out of genuine despair, a desire to spare him the pain of watching her be captured, or, as some historians have speculated, a calculated hope that news of her death might prompt him to end his own life rather than fall into Octavian's hands and be humiliated in a triumphal procession back in Rome. Vulnerability tone. Whatever her intention, the effect was immediate and devastating. Antony, upon hearing that the woman he had loved for a decade was gone, asked one of his own attendants to kill him, and when that man could not bring himself to do it and took his own life instead, Antony fell on his own sword. He did not die instantly. As he lay bleeding, another messenger arrived with the truth. That Cleopatra was, in fact, still alive, and Antony, with whatever strength remained in him, insisted on being carried to her, hoisted up through an upper window of the sealed mausoleum since the doors could not safely be opened. He died there, in her arms, according to nearly every ancient account, urging her with his final words to try to make what peace she could with Octavian, to save herself if there was any way left to do so. Octavian, when he learned Cleopatra was still alive and secured inside her mausoleum, was determined not to let her die by her own hand, at least not yet. He wanted, quite badly, to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumphal procession, a living trophy proving the totality of his victory over the last independent kingdom in the Mediterranean world, since he understood that a captured queen led through the streets of Rome in chains would cement his triumph in the public imagination far more powerfully than any amount of captured gold or territory ever could. He sent an envoy named Proculeius to negotiate with her through the sealed doors of the mausoleum, and through some combination of persuasion and deception, this envoy managed to distract Cleopatra long enough for soldiers to scale a ladder up to an open window and drop down into the chamber behind her. seizing her by force before she could reach for a dagger she reportedly had concealed on her person, wresting it from her hand before she could turn it on herself. There are accounts, likely colored by later Roman storytelling more than strict historical fact, describing a final meeting between Cleopatra and Octavian himself, in which she attempted, one last time, to use the same charm and diplomatic skill that had once won over both Caesar and Antony, presenting him with an itemized list of her remaining treasures as if to prove her cooperation, and in which Octavian, coldly, resisted her completely, giving her no assurance that she would be spared the humiliation of being marched through Rome as a conquered enemy. It was reportedly during this meeting, or shortly afterward, that Cleopatra learned with certainty that Octavian intended to keep her alive specifically for the purpose of that public humiliation, a piece of information that seems to have finally convinced her that no further negotiation was possible, and that her own death, on her own terms, was now the only form of victory left available to her. Whatever was actually said in that meeting, Cleopatra made her decision shortly afterward. She had already, according to Roman writers, spent time visiting the tomb where Antony now lay, weeping over it and leaving offerings, telling him, according to Plutarch's account, that she would soon join him, that no distance and no length of time could ever again separate them the way Octavian now intended to, on either the 10th or the 12th of August, in the year 30 before Christ. Historians still debate the exact date. She bathed, dressed herself in her finest royal robes and jewelry, arranged herself upon a golden couch, and, according to the most widely repeated ancient accounts, allowed a venomous snake, smuggled into the mausoleum inside a basket of figs, to bite her. Shocking factone. Here is something worth pausing on, though. Modern historians and toxicologists have raised serious, credible doubts about whether this famous version of events could actually be true. An Egyptian cobra large enough to be genuinely lethal would have been extremely difficult to conceal inside a small basket of fruit, and its venom, rather than producing the swift, peaceful death ancient writers describe, typically causes a slow, agonizing process involving paralysis, vomiting, and severe pain. Nothing like the gentle, dignified slipping away that Plutarch and other Roman sources chose to record. Some scholars believe it is far more likely that Cleopatra died from a fast-acting poison, perhaps concealed inside a hollow hairpin or applied as an ointment, a method consistent with her own documented research into painless methods of death, and consistent with the 2 small puncture marks that ancient writers themselves noted on her arm. Reflective tone. It is worth considering why the snake version of the story became the dominant one anyway. The asp, or Egyptian cobra, was deeply associated in Egyptian religious symbolism with royalty and with the goddess Isis, the very goddess Cleopatra had spent her entire reign identifying herself with, meaning a death by snakebite allowed Octavian's own propaganda machine to frame her final act as almost regal and mythic, a queen returning to the protection of her chosen goddess, which paradoxically made for a more compelling story in his own triumphal procession than a woman quietly poisoning herself with a hairpin ever could. Octavian, we're told, even had a statue created showing Cleopatra with a snake clinging to her image, and carried this effigy through the streets of Rome during his eventual triumph, since he could not display her actual body, robbing him, as one ancient historian bitterly noted, of the full glory he had wanted from capturing her alive. When Octavian's soldiers finally broke into the mausoleum, they found Cleopatra dead upon her golden couch, dressed in the full ceremonial regalia of an Egyptian queen, having chosen, in her very last conscious act, to control precisely how the world would remember her final appearance. Her servant Eros lay dead at her feet, while Charmion, the second attendant, was still alive, though barely, in the final moments of arranging the crown properly upon her mistress's head, even as the poison worked through her own body. One of the soldiers, according to Plutarch, angrily demanded to know whether this had truly been a fitting thing for her to do, and Charmion, with her last breath, is said to have answered that it was extremely well done, fitting for a woman descended from so many kings. She died moments later, having spent her final act of life ensuring her queen looked every inch the pharaoh she had been, even in death, a final small act of loyalty from a servant whose own name history very nearly forgot entirely, remembered today only because she chose, with her last breath, to correct a Roman soldier rather than beg for her own life. Cleopatra was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for nearly 22 years, longer than almost any monarch in her family's 3-century history, and she had done so through civil war, exile, foreign occupation, two of the most consequential political and romantic partnerships of the ancient world, and a final war that pitted the wealth and prestige of her entire kingdom against the rising, unstoppable machine of Roman imperial ambition. Octavian, honoring her final request, allowed her to be buried alongside Antony and gave Eros and Charmian proper burials as well, a small mercy amid an otherwise total and complete political victory. The aftermath came swiftly and without mercy for the family Cleopatra left behind. Her eldest son, Caesarion, then about 17 years old, had been sent away from Alexandria before the final siege, smuggled south toward the Red Sea coast with a tutor and a substantial sum of money. In what appears to have been a genuine attempt to get him somewhere safe, perhaps even out of Roman reach entirely toward India. A plan strikingly similar to one Cleopatra herself is said to have briefly considered for her own escape earlier that same summer, before the burning of her fleet in the Red Sea by a hostile Nabatean king closed off that option for good. Bold statement tone. It did not work for her son either. His own tutor, in one of history's more heartbreaking betrayals, convinced the boy to return and negotiate with Octavian, likely under the false promise of mercy or perhaps even a share of his mother's former kingdom, and Octavian, understanding with perfect clarity that a living son of Julius Caesar represented the single greatest threat to his own claim as Caesar's true heir, had Caesarion executed shortly after Cleopatra's death, reportedly on the advice of one of his own philosophical advisors, who is said to have remarked that too many Caesars was not a good thing, a grim pun on the boy's very name that sealed his fate. Antony's eldest son by a previous marriage, a young man named Antylus, barely 17 himself, was executed on the very same day. Betrayed in turn by his own tutor while seeking sanctuary at a temple built in his father's honor, dragged out from beneath a statue of the deified Julius Caesar even as he begged for his life. Cleopatra's 3 younger children by Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, then about 10 years old, and their small brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, only about 6, were spared, likely because their youth made them useful trophies rather than genuine political threats. Octavian brought them back to Rome and paraded them through the city in his eventual triumphal procession. 3 frightened children walking in chains, or according to some accounts, walking freely but under heavy guard, behind an effigy of their dead mother clutched by an artificial snake, before handing them over to be raised, in an act of remarkable grace, by none other than Octavia, Antony's spurned Roman wife, the same woman he had abandoned years earlier in favor of Cleopatra. Vulnerability tone. It is one of the more quietly extraordinary details buried in this entire story, that the children of the woman who had effectively ended her marriage were raised afterward inside the household of the wife that marriage had wronged, and that Octavia, by every surviving account, treated them with genuine care alongside her own children. History loses track of what became of the 2 boys, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, and most historians assume they died young, perhaps of illness, though no source records exactly when or how, their names simply vanishing from the historical record within a few years of the triumph, unremarked upon by any surviving writer of the period. Cleopatra Selene, however, survived into adulthood, growing up within Octavia's own household alongside her cousins and half-siblings, and was eventually married off by Octavian to Juba II. a highly educated North African client king who had himself been raised in Rome and had absorbed a deep appreciation for Hellenistic scholarship and culture. Together, Cleopatra, Selene, and Juba ruled the kingdom of Mauritania with genuine success for decades, building a capital city they named Caesarea in a careful nod to Roman sensibilities. And Cleopatra, Selene, by all accounts, never entirely let go of her Ptolemaic heritage, naming her own son Ptolemy in deliberate homage to the dynasty her mother had once ruled, meaning that some faint thread of Cleopatra's bloodline continued on, ruling over a kingdom far from the Nile for at least another generation, until that final grandson was himself executed by a later, far more paranoid Roman emperor nearly 70 years after Cleopatra's own death, finally extinguishing the last living link to the house of Ptolemy for good. With Cleopatra dead and Caesarion executed, Egypt's 3-century-old Ptolemaic dynasty came to its final end. Octavian annexed the kingdom directly as his own personal territory, refusing to grant it the status of an ordinary Roman province, governed by a senator, choosing instead to control its immense wealth and its critical grain supply entirely through his own appointed prefect. A decision so deliberate that he reportedly forbade any senator from even visiting Egypt without his personal permission, understanding better than anyone alive exactly how dangerous it would be to let any ambitious rival get their hands on the same combination of wealth and grain that had briefly made Antony and Cleopatra so formidable. This arrangement made Egypt uniquely and permanently subject to whoever held supreme power in Rome, a private domain within the empire rather than a province shared with the traditional machinery of republican government. He used the vast treasury he seized from Cleopatra's palace to pay off the enormous debts he owed his own veteran soldiers, a financial windfall so significant that it single-handedly stabilized his political position, allowed him to reduce interest rates across the entire Roman economy almost overnight, and gave him the resources to consolidate control over the entire Roman world without further serious challenge. Bold statement tone. Within a few short years, the young man once known simply as Octavian would be granted a new name by the Roman Senate, Augustus, meaning the revered one, and would become, in every practical sense, Rome's first emperor, transforming a republic that had governed itself through elected magistrates and a deliberative senate for nearly 5 centuries into an empire ruled by a single man. A transformation made possible in no small part by the wealth, propaganda victory, and eliminated rival that his defeat of Cleopatra had provided him. And Cleopatra herself, in the centuries that followed, became something almost entirely separate from the intelligent, multilingual, politically brilliant queen who had actually lived and governed and fought to preserve her kingdom's independence for over 2 decades. Reflective tone. Roman writers, working under an empire founded by the very man who had defeated her, had every incentive to paint her as a dangerous foreign temptress, a corrupting Eastern influence who had nearly brought down 2 of Rome's greatest men through nothing more than seduction and sorcery, because that version of the story made Augustus look not merely victorious, but genuinely heroic, a savior of Roman virtue rather than simply the winner of yet another brutal civil war. That distorted image, shaped by centuries of Roman propaganda and later amplified by playwrights, painters, and filmmakers who found her tragic love affairs far more commercially appealing than her tax policies or her grain administration, is largely the Cleopatra most people still picture today when they picture her at all. A woman defined entirely by the men she loved, rather than by the kingdom she spent her entire adult life fighting to protect. The real woman underneath that myth was something far more interesting and far more impressive. A queen who inherited a bankrupt, shrinking kingdom surrounded by a rising imperial power that had already swallowed nearly every other independent state in the Mediterranean, and who managed through sheer intelligence, education, charisma, and an almost unbreakable will to survive, to keep that kingdom independent for 22 years longer than anyone might reasonably have expected. allying herself in turn with the two most powerful men Rome ever produced, raising 4 children amid constant political peril, mastering more languages than almost any other monarch of her era, and choosing, in the very end, to die on her own terms, dressed as a pharaoh, rather than be dragged through the streets of a foreign city in chains. She was the last of the Ptolemies, the final pharaoh to ever sit upon the throne of Egypt in a line that stretched back, through her Macedonian ancestors, all the way to Alexander the Great himself, and when she died, an entire chapter of the ancient world, stretching back 3,000 years to the first pharaohs of the Nile, closed with her, never to reopen again under a native or Hellenistic ruler of Egypt's own choosing. Everything that came after belonged to Rome. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, walking through the extraordinary, complicated, and ultimately tragic life of one of history's most remarkable women. If her story moved you, let me know in the comments which moment stayed with you the most, and I will see you in the next one.